Mr. Kennedy, thank you for your time. Let's jump straight into it.
Thank you for having me.
As most of the world's attention is focused on Israel and Ukraine, the plight of Armenians is ignored and overlooked. Why is that?
I think it's a number of reasons. I think the central reason is that the U.S. policy, which is largely driven by the neocons in the State Department and in the White House, sees the world as a battle between a geopolitical contest between major powers. So Russia, they're basically trying to restart the Cold War. So Russia becomes the focus, and Iran is the focus. And any action by the United States that does not advance the contest between Russia and the United States and Iran and the United States is put on the sideline. And when in April of 2022, when President Biden asked, "Why are we at war in Ukraine?" his answer was, "Because we want to do regime change with Vladimir Putin." So Ukraine, which has no geographical, or geopolitical significance to the United States, it has no strategic significance to the United States, suddenly became all important because it was a proxy or a pawn in our battle with Russia, our supposed battle. And I think Armenia has been caught up in that dynamic where anything that happens in Armenia is downgraded. So even when there's a humanitarian crisis, and what happened, in 2022 between 2022 and now was just a continuation of the 1915 genocide, when 1.2 million Armenians were killed, were butchered. And this is ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. And, it began with the blockade, and then, was completed with the expulsion, and then the hostage taking of political leaders. And that is a humanitarian crisis, which we should be responding to in a humanitarian way. But instead, it's sidelined because Azerbaijan has become kind of an ally of the United States for a lot of reasons. One, it provides gas and oil to Europe. So it supplants some of the gas and oil that we're trying to cut off from Russia. It also has a border with Iran. And we want to keep Azerbaijan friendly to the United States because we see Iran as part of the Russian coalition. And so U.S. policymakers are trying to brush this under the table and pretend it's not happening because it doesn't advance our battle with Russia and with Iran.
With that said, Ukraine and Israel armed and continue to arm Azerbaijan and enabled them to ethnically cleanse the Armenians of their indigenous Artsakh. Why have they not been held accountable? Where is the news coverage?
I think they're not held accountable for the same reason that the real enemies are regarded as Russia and Iran, and we have a law in this country that we passed in 1992 forbidding our country from giving aid to Azerbaijan. That we passed another law in 2001 that allowed the president to suspend our essentially sanctions against Azerbaijan, and the president has repeatedly done that. So it's against the law, it's against that law called the Freedom Support Act, Section 907, that forbids America from giving aid to Azerbaijan, but that is constantly being suspended because we see Azerbaijan as kind of an ally or a potential ally that we do not want sucked into the Russian sphere or the Iranian sphere.
Perfect. So talks are ongoing about the possibility of sanctioning Azerbaijan. Where does the U.S. stand in this regard, and what would potential sanctions look like?
Well, my hope would be that the sanctions would hold responsible directly the individuals who were responsible for human rights violations, for the mass slaughter of Armenians in Artsakh, and for the decisions to ethnically cleanse Artsakh. As president, I will begin on day one by making this a priority, by using the bully pulpit of the presidency to condemn what happened, to urge our European allies to also join in sanctions against Azerbaijan.
So you've held quite the strong stance on Armenian issues, from recognizing the Armenian genocide to your commitment towards the restoration of Artsakh. With that said, how do you plan on turning words into action? While the 1915 Armenian genocide was recognized by President Biden, the 2023 ethnic cleansing of Artsakh was enabled by him. Why recognize one genocide and allow another to happen?
Again, I think it's the same reason that we are allowing Turkey to get away with the genocide of the Kurds in northern Syria. The Kurds were our closest allies. They fought with us against ISIS. They died for American cause, for American values. And now we are standing on the sideline and letting Turkey essentially do a giant land grab in northern Syria, because Turkey is our NATO ally. Turkey is a potential ally in our struggle with Russia, and also a very important ally in the minds of the neocon against the emergence of Iran as a global power. And so I think, within the neocons in the White House, they believe that the genocide is just an embarrassing issue that we need to cover up, and they've been able to do that because of the indifference of the American press. You don't see anything written about Artsakh. This is a real genocide. It's actually happening. It's 120,000 people that were forced, the indigenous people of Artsakh, who were forced from their home, from their homeland that they have been on for over 1,000 years. Right now, we're seeing many of the artifacts of Armenian culture, the architecture, the buildings being bulldozed to erase any sign of Armenia. This is the definition of genocide.
So it's clear that the current Armenian administration is pivoting towards the U.S. and the West, as the Pashinyan government in Armenia looks to leave the CSTO. Where is the West in helping Armenia? As land is being ceded and Azerbaijani forces occupy large swaths of Armenia, what promises have been made to Armenia by the U.S. and the West?
Well, I think all the promises that were made in the humanitarian conventions and the genocide convention have been broken. That we've allowed Azerbaijan and enabled Azerbaijan to walk into Artsakh. And I think, again, we're doing that because it serves the geopolitical interests as outlined by the neocons. I don't think it's in U.S. interest to have a war with Russia. I don't think it's good for our country. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's good for the people of Russia, for Ukraine, for Europe. I think it's been a catastrophe, and it's actually made Russia stronger. Russia's now essentially immune from sanctions. President Putin is stronger than ever. We are closer to a nuclear exchange with Russia than at any time since 1962. The Russians have 2,500 more missiles than we do. They have a better defensive system than we do, and the whole world is hoping that we don't accelerate this to a nuclear exchange. As president, I'm going to de-escalate the tensions with Russia and China. If we were living in a multipolar world, America would thrive. We would regain our moral leadership. We would rebuild our economy. We would once again be the leader that people want us to be in the world. And we could redirect our agenda towards humanitarian issues, which is the role that America is supposed to play instead of this geopolitical contest for hegemon and for domination. And I think that has always been bad for our country, and that it's a catastrophe today, not only for our country, but for the people of Armenia, and particularly the 120,000 refugees who've been driven from Artsakh.
So given Azerbaijan's invasion and subsequent ethnic cleansing campaign ridding Artsakh of its indigenous Armenians, what actions would your administration take to address the consequences of these events and support the displaced Armenian population? What role do you see for the U.S. in resolving conflicts in regions like Artsakh, and how would you approach peace-building efforts there?
I would say this, that number one, through condemnation, by telling the world and telling them again and again, this is a genocide, it's a humanitarian catastrophe, and this has got to be a priority for all of us. And to bring in the European Union, which is buying gas and oil from Azerbaijan, and to bring in the World Court to make sure that the people the government officials in Azerbaijan who orchestrated this humanitarian catastrophe, this mass killing, the mass eviction, the genocide, that they are held responsible.
There are many reports of the gas that Azerbaijan is sending to Europe is actually Russian gas that's just repackaged as Azerbaijani gas, and it's being shipped to Europe, and everyone is just not talking about the elephant in the room, but I feel like they all know about it. How do you stop things like that?
Well, we have legal sanctions against Russia. We should be prosecuting when people violate those sanctions, or the sanctions become laughable. And if Russia is using Azerbaijan, as it appears to be, as a front to market its gas and to evade the sanctions, Azerbaijan should also be held responsible for that.
So let's move on to NATO. So America's NATO ally, Turkey, is often at the forefront of conflict, be it actively denying genocide, emboldening ethnic cleansing campaigns, engaging in proxy conflicts in the Middle East, harboring terrorists, stirring the pot in Syria, occupying half of Cyprus, and the list goes on. How would your administration keep Turkey in check given its appetite for war and expansion?
Well, I think there's no effort right now to keep them in check, and it's because we've chosen to make a foreign policy that is very belligerent particularly toward Russia, and Turkey in that conflict has become a vital ally. It's a bulwark against Russia in the minds of the neocons who are making decisions in the White House and the State Department, and as a result, it becomes untouchable. So it can get away with what it's doing with the genocide in northern Syria of the Kurds. It can get away with the occupation of half of Cyprus. It can get away with enabling and participating in the genocide in Artsakh, and nobody says anything. And I think what I will do as president is to de-escalate tensions with Russia and with China and bring them into the world community so that everybody can look at something that is a humanitarian crisis and saying, this is a humanitarian crisis. It doesn't serve anybody's geopolitical needs, and separate it from this political contest and look at it for what it actually is.
What do you see as a role for the U.S. and NATO, for NATO?
It's interesting that NATO was never supposed to be a permanent coalition against Russia. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower, in the middle of his presidency, said that if we all do our job, if NATO does its job, within 5 years it will be gone. What it's become is an instrument for feeding a pipeline of new wars. And that's never what it was supposed to do. A lot of the initial concept of NATO is no longer workable. It's no longer realistic or pragmatic. NATO, the central agreement in NATO, in Article 5 of NATO, requires that if Europe is attacked, NATO nations in Europe are attacked by Russia, that the U.S. will come to their aid. Well, right now, it would be almost impossible because of the advent of these new hypersonic missiles. It would be almost impossible to get 1 million men, Americans, across the Atlantic. There would be such a terrible loss of life that the American people would not put up with it. And I'm going to work as President of the United States to reassess the role of NATO, to make it actually a peacekeeping organization rather than a war-making organization and coalition. And I think NATO, if we don't do that, NATO is going to collapse under its own weight. There are already nations like Greece that are saying if we invoke Article 5 in Ukraine, that Greece will not be part of it. So, and I think that there are other nations in NATO who are also very, very uneasy about being drawn into a war, a full-blown world war with Russia. And if those nations walk away from Article 5, NATO ceases to exist. And I think we need to recognize this reality and make the mission of NATO, instead of a belligerent mission against Russia, to make it an instrument for bringing all nations into the world community.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.